Very
There we
good.
go.
Perfect. Patrick.
Yes.
What else?
So I guess the next natural question is, eventually in a scenario in which these revisionist states are defeated, what would like the international structure of cooperation and alliances look like? Would it look like these kind of global institutions, or would it look like these, historical attempts to create these like regional multilateral institutions? Like during the Cold War, the United States didn't just attempt NATO; they also attempted things like the Baghdad Pact, SEATO, and there are other like successful local cooperation instances like the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. So would ideally you have these more regionalistic groups, or do you have like more global integration broadly, or to be some combination thereof?
So the first question is about NATO. I don't think we need regional pacts, yeah? And I'm also a bit critical to the United States AUKUS and all these bilateral agreements, because it's much better we take responsibility together. And the real war, as always, is happening between Russia and Europe. And here, we should actually expand NATO, enlarge NATO, involve Australia and New Zealand in NATO. Why not? They have been key contributors to both world wars on the good side. Yeah? Their soldiers were fighting in Gallipoli and in many battle zones in Africa for the British. And it's very logical that Australia and New Zealand are part of the free world of the West. They should be in NATO. The same true for Japan. Japan, of course, yeah, NATO. Why not? South Korea, NATO. Because here comes the logic. Yeah? The logic is not a unilateral world by America, but NATO is a bilateral, it's a multilateral organization, and it takes Europe as well in the responsibility for the security of East Asia. Why not? It is not just America's issue what happens in Taiwan or in Japan or South Korea. It's also, we have 500 million, 700, all over, we are 700 million Europeans in free Europe, outside of Russia. So we can contribute financially, technically. We don't have the same military assets and not the capacity and not the will to fight. But, we also should defend Japan. So I'm much more for one global alliance, which is called NATO. And yes, we have anyhow a global partnership already of NATO, which is a softer form of cooperation with Japan and with many of them. So good. But why not? The North Atlantic is, just a geographic term which was relevant after the Second World War. But we should have one structure, because as we have seen, the Baghdad Pact and the SEATO and so, it's all then basically, it leaves Europe out. And these bilateral obligations of America to do without Europe. That's why I'm also campaigning now on Twitter for Israel membership in NATO, because America is defending Israel and we Europeans stand aside and give only rhetorical support, like nice tweets and speeches. Yeah. It's not good enough. Ultimately, NATO is also not the automatic defense alliance. Yeah, it's always a question what we do in case of war. So, it doesn't mean that by any moment somebody is attacked, everybody has to do nuclear escalation. This is not the NATO, but that we somehow are united and theoretically, in case it's needed, can mobilize all our unlimited economic and fiscal resources to the defense of Japan and South Korea. I think we should add, and that would be much better if they're also full member of NATO. That's on the NATO question. I personally love very much the organization called OECD. This is Economic and Development Cooperation. It's seated in Paris. It's less famous, but I think it should be the union of market democracies. So we should much faster enlarge it. It's one of our strategic problems that after Russia turned rogue completely in 2011, we have basically put OECD enlargement on a back burner. Some smaller countries have still joined, like I think it was Costa Rica and Colombia. That's all very nice, but we should really somehow be a bit more faster and compete with BRICS, because that's basically the competition to BRICS. Yeah, and BRICS is valueless and worthless organization, but it's a big show, and they are quite easy to take in new countries. And we are very complicated because, of course, we have a lot of requirements, taxes, environment, social welfare, 100 things which are good to have. But, it's also good to have Brazil in OECD. and we can then contribute over the next 100 years for a perfect environment in Brazil, perfect labor standards. You know, the idea that the whole world must be perfect before they join our institutions, while BRICS is expanding, is a little bit, you know, the nightmare of a bureaucrat. Yeah? The Russians are taking in everybody, and we are saying, oh, your environmental standards are not perfect. This is, I think, a very failed system. Let's talk about the big issue about the United Nations reform. Obviously, that's theoretically a very good organization. We need it, but it has many, many flaws. Yeah? And the flaws come mostly from having Russia on the UN Security Council and having allowed China to take over the seat of Free China in 1971. And both is very questionable. Why Russia has the seat of the Soviet Union, why Communist Russia has the seat of Free Russia, and both of them have UN security power as a veto in the Security Council. And then they say the world is unfair because the UN is not reforming. Yes, I mean, there are many reform proposals. I have drafted many of them. So my perfect model is India should take the place of Russia in the UN Security Council. It's 10 times bigger. It just didn't exist as an independent state in 1945. It was created 2 years later. But India is the perfect candidate for that. Yeah, why not? Yeah, I say also that the Organization of American States, because I believe very much in political regional integration, that would be very good country regional organization. The African Union, the Association of Southeast Asian States. Yes, and the European Union should take over the seat of France. Why has France a seat with 67 million people? We are all in all 450 million people in the European Union, so we must have the seat, yeah? And France has to give it to us. I'm also in favor of the UK to turn back to the European Union, and then we have one seat only, because we have, I said already, about in that European Union, including Ukraine and the Balkans and the United Kingdom, theoretically, we are about 600 million people. But 600 million is just half of India, half of China. Why should we have 2 seats? It's 1 seat enough, yeah? Okay, in the case of the United States, it's obviously, you know, you are the anchor power of the world. It's justified to have one. But I say 8 seats in the UN Security Council is a justified number. And this is very clear. I'm also advocating for Japan to join the Association of Southeast Asian States, because Japan should also reform a little bit, and also South Korea should join there. So it's maybe basically China, India, Southeast Asian enlarged, that's 3. And then it's the African Union, the European Union, and the American Union, basically. And then it's the United States of America, which has a special privileged situation in a way, in my kind of concept of joining. And then I'm for something like out of the ex-Russian states from the Asian continent, and also the so-called the Islamic world from the Middle East, if you want. I'm very much in favor of having a so-called Northwestern Asian Association, simply something similar like the Southeast Asian. That's a bit complicated to explain, but I was thinking how to organize the Islamic world in a global level to have a seat at the UN Security Council. And I'm against having something like Islamic organization, because there are 2 big Islamic associations as well. It's called the Organization of Islamic States. But I don't think that we politically in the 20th century should have a political representation on the global level according to religious terms. Yeah? And it's also not completely justified, because all these countries have also many, many minorities which are not Islamic. So I say a similar situation like the ASEAN for Northwestern Asia. And that is my proposal for that more complicated regions. That would be basically 8 seats at the UN Security Council. And obviously, I'm in favor of active membership only for countries who pay membership fee and who also keep the standards. Because the biggest problem in the UN is the following. If I break the law, I invade Ukraine, I still sit on the UN Security Council and I have voting rights if I'm Russia. So, you know, you break all the rules, you destroy the house, and you're still invited for the party to be the decision maker who should, what the party should do, basically. This is happening in no company, in no association, in no, the moment you break the rules permanently, You're kicked out of the family, of the house, of the company, out of the state. You're put in prison. Just in the UN, it's the only organization, institution ever in the history where you can break every rule and you still sit in the law-giving, in the rule-giving institution at the top. And this makes the UN very problematic, because then it loses all the legitimacy. And the perfidy of Russia is that they claim it on us. You see, the UN is not working, but because of Russia and China. And this is the problem here. And this is my reform proposal, to have 8 permanent members, and to have a mechanism when you break the rules, you lose your voting rights and you are basically in the dog's house. And Russia literally should be absolutely in the dog's house. They have broken all the rules in 2008, started several wars everywhere, and they have committed so many crimes internally and externally, and they have no right to sit in the UN Security Council in that condition, and they must be expelled, and there must be India taking over their place. This is my short-term remedy, and France to get the seat of the to give the seat to the European Union. These are the 2 most important measures for global governance, which everybody who loves peace should support.
Okay, I mean, that all makes sense. I think you're right that like the Organization of Islamic Cooperation wouldn't be a coherent basis for like representing adequately, for instance, the Arab states, because, you know, the largest Muslim majority country on earth is Indonesia, which is not at all Arab, not really tied into these like particular Middle Eastern and North African issues. I'm also very curious of your opinion on the march of right-wing populism across Europe, because I mean, we're going to get, I think, the first exit polls from the Netherlands in about 5 minutes, where Wilders might win. We have this new government in Italy, and I think there was a very valid concern several years ago when it seemed like there were these very obvious links between these right-wing populist movements and Russia. But since the invasion, those ties have kind of, you know, disappeared. Like Meloni explicitly describes herself as an Atlanticist, and like even if these are sympathies lurking in the background, they're not to the fore. They're not something that these movements are campaigning on as much. And so I'm curious if you think that like these right-wing populist movements are an existential threat for European liberal democracy, or if they're just simply an expansion of the political landscape.
Look, you know, the word existential threat, yeah, you know, it's a big word. You know, I know that political scientists like to use that, yeah, but, you know, the existential threat for was the Soviet Union to Europe, yeah? Or the Nazi Empire. These were existential threats, yeah. You know, this kind of extremist parties, you have to also make a big differences between the regions and between the countries, yeah. Because it looks, of course, when you look from America and you see this, you know, then you see, oh, popping up everywhere, must be the same, yeah. But, you know, the Dutch, for example, are a very civilized nation. You know, it's a very, very high level of civil liberty. So it's not exactly the Nazis taking over there. I don't know much about Mr. Wilders, but, you know, let's keep the things under perspective, yeah. And, you know, you have also in Italy, you know, it's a complicated country. I love Italy and Italians. It's fascinating for me, but it has this very specific kind of history. And, you know, I don't want to defend Mrs. Meloni and the movement she comes from, but now in the biggest test of European history, which is existential in a way, that's the Russian aggression against Ukraine, and the big answers we have to do in energy, military, in social welfare, inflation, all the consequences. That's really quite big, yeah. That's maybe since the last 50 years our biggest challenge, since the 1970s, when the Soviet Union was so strong, and we were really also on the margins. But Mrs. Meloni, you know, she has been proven very reasonable person. Even the center-left-wing president of the United States, yeah, Uncle Joe, he likes her quite a lot, yeah. And she has been very, very good on Ukraine, and she has delivered a lot of weapons. So she is far from perfect, but we have not seen so many perfect politicians from Italy recently. And, you know, Mr. Berlusconi, God bless him, he was also a very questionable character in some aspects of his life, yeah. So let's see Italy, you know, and it's not exactly also, you know, it's not the 1920s in Europe or 1930s, yeah, here. We are a very rich continent. We are socially and in many aspects stable economically. We have also 16 trillion GDP here in the European Union. So we are not as rich as the United States. We are actually falling behind the United States a bit, yeah. But we are still, you know, quite okay here in principle. So it's not that the misery and the disaster is breaking out and the brown or black hemps are not marching in our streets, yeah, just to make the perspective here clear. And, you know, you have still a lot of Russian influence on that one. You know, it might be not Meloni with Russia, but it's very much Orban with Russia in Hungary. It's very much Mr. Salvini, who was her transport minister. He has a lot of Russian links for sure. The Austrian and the German populists have a lot of links with Russia for sure. And so, by the way, does the German left has a lot of links with Russia. Mr. Schröder might be remembered. So Russia's hand in terms of political funding is very much in the rise. Of course, since the 2022 war, there is a little bit of less attractiveness to make photos with Putin. And even the worst populist has understood that somebody, because most Europeans are quite rational and, you know, if you kill somebody with tanks and rockets, nobody really likes that. So, of course, you know, the populists have some kind of case here with the energy crisis, with inflation, and with, of course, this is always the big topic in migration, like you have it in the United States with the southern border, which the Republicans claim to be a crisis. But, you know, this you can always exaggerate things, yeah? Because in a country like the United States, which has taken, I think you have 80 million people now in a generation more, from 250 to 340. That was my latest when I looked, yeah? You know, if there are 100,000 more people coming over a border a year, and even if it's a million, yeah, it's not the end of the world. So from an existential crisis far away. And let's not forget, Europe is much further to the crisis points of Libya and Turkey and Syria. And we have seen Russian hand very much in Syria. Let's not forget, you know, the reason why we had millions of people walking into European safety in 2015 was very much the Russian bombs on Aleppo. Yes, you know, it's not just the funding of Russia. Russia is very able to do a multi-level strategy to hurt Europe, yeah, and the West. Yeah. They are not just paying one right-wing populist some money to build a party and build a website, yeah, or have some money for his living, or putting 10 million euros into Mrs. Le Pen. But they are able also to drop bombs on Aleppo and chase a lot of people, or to keep Assad in power, or to do other crises like, you know, of course, the Ukraine war, which has added another 4 million Europeans, or 5 million is the number. I don't know exactly the number. Somewhere 4 to 5 million Ukrainians are now additional in Europe. And that, of course, our refugee camps and the whole system of incoming, because in Europe we have very advanced system of incoming asylum, welcoming people. You know, we have this whole system of how to get status, protected status, assess the status, and of course, how to help them. That this is a bit overcrowded after we had taken in several millions of Syrians and so many people from Africa, and now another 5 million of Ukrainians, and this all in 7 years. I mean, this is not an easy thing to do. By the way, the America could help us and take in more Ukrainians, so for example, and you're not very helpful on that, for example. So, and yeah, what I can say, this is the big takeover of the populists in Central Europe will not happen. You know, you have, of course, Orban. This is a specific problem. He tried to take over Slovakia, but his guy has only 22%. Yeah. Meloni is a specific phenomenon. She has transformed now, without me defending her here on this show, but, you know, she is basically much more a center-right politician than an extreme fascist or something, yeah? And she sees herself as well. He has a lot of interest to join the EPP and to leave all these Orban people aside, yeah? Because her character is basically very mainstreamy in managing things, and she wants to be recognized like that, yeah? In the Netherlands, I don't know the situation very well, but the big takeover, I don't see it. Nowhere, basically. Now in Spain, the center-left has power. In Germany, center-left has power. And we will not suddenly glide into extremism. This is not going to happen. because, most Europeans know history very well, and they don't want to be associated with the extreme right, and certainly not fall into this kind of gap. And we will see in some countries, obviously, results under these economic shocks and the shock of the war of 30%. Yes, but then there will be coalitions against this, and they will be not included, not in Germany, not in Austria, I would guess so, into the governing, because especially the Austrian populists, which I know the best, they have been very pro-Russian now in the war, and they will certainly not be taken into power in the Austrian government under such conditions. And so I would not be too worried. And, if you're worried, vote for a decent liberal, green social democrat, or for the decent center right-wing parties, because there are decent center right-wing parties as well. And my hope again is, that also in the US, there will be no bad example anymore, no Trump to be elected, because don't forget, all these mini Trumps, they came after Trump came first. It was not that Trump has copied some European politician, but it was everybody thinking, oh, when the Americans voted Trump, then we have to produce a Trump as well. And if you would be, for example, so kind to nominate Nikki Haley as a GOP candidate, as a decent center right-wing person, then suddenly many European center right-wing parties would say, okay, let's put some reasonable person up, because the Euro-Americans have shown us we can also win with a decent agenda. And that was the very negative effect that Trump, and by the way, his Russian backers and money boxes, they had on the global democracy, because then many people think, the Americans vote for such a guy, we have to produce and we have to behave similar. And I hope that you will be a good leadership example in 2024, elect a reasonable guy, and then you will see suddenly the world will follow America again in that one as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess just as a final question, I'm curious what your advice or message to like the next generation of policymakers and politicians as they confront, the issues which you've discussed, potentially so far as the Russian breakup, but even just in general, this kind of movement away from multilateralism and towards, like new protectionism and new nationalist impulses, what your general advice would be.
We need to believe in our values, and we need to believe in NATO and in our institutions. This withdrawal towards protectionism, populism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism is a total disaster. So we must really be very focused on what made the West strong, and that's the unity of America and Europe. We need a free trade agreement with the United States of America. We need the EU to join NATO. We need to enlarge NATO. We need to enlarge the European Union. We need to enlarge the OECD. We need to make a global, stable economic system in terms of IMF and the world currencies. We need more currencies to be back to the dollar and to the euro. We need lower taxes and more economic growth. We need to change towards greener energy to be less dependent. It's not only CO2, which is a problem, no doubt, but it's not about climate change, but about strategic independence of the free world from the Arab and from the Russian autocracies which control the petrol resources. And this is a big disaster. So everybody using electric car or to use less petrol is very good. So we need to have more trust in technology, because technology makes us the people who, because technology is impression of human genuinity, innovation. This is what free people do. So we must believe in and also work on technology innovation and support individual freedom, but also be more united as the Union of Free States. This is what we need to do, and less of this kind of negativism, against Washington, against Brussels, but more kind of trust in our institutions. And basically, we have been very successful thanks to American leadership, and your institutions, our institutions together, we will be very successful. The next 30 years will be the best ahead if we win this war now, and we will win it. And so let's work on it.
I really appreciate
Slava Ukraine is the last sentence I wanted to make, because ultimately it's about Ukraine. When we win there, we will be very successful, and we must win there. Sorry for interrupting.
No, It's all good. I mean, I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. This was very cool. Obviously, you just had this 2 hour Russian state TV special about you. You've been brought up as this kind of big bad by Vucic, but I'm really glad that you were willing to take the time to sit down and talk for an hour with, a student journalist.
I'm very happy you invited me because, for example, the Russian state TV, they didn't invite me. They made me quite famous in Russia, seemingly, because I was on this big show. And also Vucic and Dodik have not invited me for any kind of rebuttal or discussion or statement. And I'm happy that I could make my case. Because contrary to what the Russian state TV has said about me, I'm not a psychopath. I'm an economist and I'm very rational and decent person. And thanks for giving me this opportunity here to be on your channel, and all the best. And please, America, keep Europe free, help us to win this war in Ukraine, and we will all really be very successful for the next generation to come if we defeat this authoritarian challenge and this attack on our lifestyle, on our freedoms, which Russia is doing now.
Well, thanks again. Have a great rest of your day and take care.
Happy Thanksgiving. All the best.
Yeah, I guess it doesn't apply to you, but happy Thanksgiving.
Thanks. All the best. Bye. Thanks for the interview.